In St. Peter's Square in Rome, there's a plaque that kind of stands on one of the stones there in the square. And this plaque in St. Peter's Square marks the place where there was an assassination attempt on the life of St. John Paul II. And as you might know from history, St. John Paul II survived. But what came after that was quite interesting and became kind of an iconic moment captured in photographs and in kind of newsreels. After Pope John Paul II had recovered in hospital, he went to the prison to visit the individual who had tried to assassinate him. And there in prison, he spoke with this man, he prayed with this man, and he ultimately forgave him. And again, pictures were taken there and people saw this, and it became quite iconic, especially the way it describes or epitomizes the message of today's gospel. In today's gospel, Jesus says really that the mark of a Christian is that we are able to love our enemies, that we are able to forgive those who harm us. Jesus goes on to say, look, it's easy enough to be kind to those who are kind to you, but really what will distinguish us as followers of Christ is our ability to love our enemies. This is a very difficult teaching, and maybe you could even consider at this moment someone who you might think is an enemy in your life, someone who might have harmed you or someone who hurt you. We all have kind of people like this in our life, don't we? And the kind of idea that we would love this person, do goodness and kindness to them, is very difficult. For this reason, it can be helpful to have kind of models or witnesses to this great Christian witness, such as John Paul II, as I mentioned. Other examples come to mind for me as well. I remember when I was young, I watched a movie. It's called The Mission. Maybe some of you have seen it. It's with Robert De Niro and Jeremy Irons when they're quite younger actors. But this movie is based more or less loosely on a real story about Jesuit missionaries who are in South America with indigenous people there. And they were there with the indigenous people, and they were trying to protect them from different Europeans who were coming to colonize them, to take advantage of them. At a certain point, the colonizers, in fact, went in and wanted by force to take over these areas, to really kind of oppress the indigenous people. And the different Jesuits and indigenous decided to take different roads that were there. Robert De Niro led a group to take up armed resistance, but another group chose a different path, a path of peaceful non-resistance. They went out and they prayed for their enemies who were hurting them, who were persecuting them. In the end, great damage was done to all the indigenous people who were there, but this witness of peaceful resistance, of forgiveness, of praying for their enemies was very, very inspiring. You can think of even other examples, sometimes from people who are not Christian. I'm thinking of the example of Gandhi. You might be aware that he led this peaceful resistance movement when he was in India trying to overcome what was very harmful impacts of the British Empire at that time. And Gandhi was famous again for being peaceful in his resistance. And he was often asked about this. Why are you taking this sort of tactic? And Gandhi responded, an eye for the eye, an eye for an eye only makes the world go blind. This way he was kind of responding back with this Christian principle that we hear in the gospel today about how we are to love our enemies, to pray for them. Jesus says in the end that this is what should distinguish us as his followers. But again, this is a very difficult teaching. It is difficult to do in practice. And we can think again of maybe people who have hurt us, how hard it can be to forgive them, to love them as Jesus calls us to. We can, I think, kind of approach this topic in an easier way if we understand a little bit or consider a little bit of what kind of love maybe Jesus is calling us to do. One aspect that can make this teaching so challenging is that we think love is something emotional, right? If I love somebody, I should have good emotions towards that person. And to have those kind of feelings for someone who has hurt us is really impossible. But to keep in mind that there are different kinds of love, and the kind of love that Jesus is talking about today is this agape love, a love that wills the good of the other person. St. Thomas Aquinas would say it this way, that to love is to will the good of the other. Jesus in the Gospels as well tells us that we are loving our enemy when we are able to pray for them. This really, I think, is a great test of whether we're able to forgive or even love our enemies. If we can say a prayer for that person, to surrender them to God, to kind of ask that God will bring goodness into their life. Love, then, is not something that is meant to be emotional, but love really is trying to look out for the good of the other. Jesus in the Gospel today as well gives us some other helpful pointers for how we can begin to love our enemies. Jesus says that we should not judge, we should not condemn. And this teaching of Jesus can take kind of various interpretations, but one way I like to think about it, or I find helpful to think about it, is what Jesus did on the cross. So when Jesus was being crucified on the cross, he looked and he saw those people around him who were putting him to death, that were causing him to suffer. And he said, "Forgive them, Father, for they do not know what they are doing." Jesus asked that they be forgiven, and that second part is so interesting, for they do not know what they are doing. This, I think, is one way Jesus was living this teaching that he says in the Gospel. He was not trying to judge those people or condemn them. In some ways, he was trying to make excuses for them, not to excuse the behavior, but to make excuses for them. And forgiving and loving our enemies can be aided when we try to do this. We don't want to excuse bad behavior, but sometimes we can, almost as Jesus did on the cross, make excuses for those people, to recognize that maybe this person is behaving in this way because they're enduring some personal struggles. Maybe they're hurting us because they were hurt greatly in the past. Maybe, for example, they're not knowing what they're doing, just as Jesus says about those who are persecuting them. This doesn't necessarily make the behavior correct, doesn't necessarily make the pain go away, but it can help us to be a bit more understanding. It can help us then to forgive, to pray for that person. Today then, inspired and strengthened by the Eucharist and the teaching of Jesus, let us attempt to put into this practice this incredibly inspiring but also difficult teaching of Jesus. Perhaps during this Mass we can consider someone in our life who we might think to be an enemy, and let us offer to this person to God in prayer as a very practical way that we are trying to live out this teaching of Christ, to love our enemies, to forgive them, and to pray for them.